We have a number of ruling elders, kind of like lay elders, in addition to myself, who function as our elder team or whatever. And sometimes I feel like they are more concerned about evangelism than I am. And I think that's like a very helpful, like they've drunk the Kool-Aid all the way down to the point that they were like, they'll push me to be like, I think we need more things that are oriented towards, people in the community, people in the neighborhood, towards some unconvinced people. Like, I think we're tilting a little too far to one side or the other. And so I think that would be one little piece of evidence that some people have sort of gotten it to the point that they're pushing the person who wrote those words, me, to actually believe them and live them out.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sowers Podcast. My name is Matt Naismith, and I am your host. This podcast features stories of Canadian church planters and leaders who are influencing kingdom movement and impacting their communities. Whether you're a church planter, pastor in a church, part of a church planting team, or someone just wanting to learn more, we pray you get inspired to become a sower in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. We pray this is a blessing to you, and if it is, we would ask you to share links to episodes, subscribe on whatever platform you are using. With that, let's get to our next conversation. Well, welcome back, friends, to the Sowers Podcast. It's time for another episode and another conversation that will hopefully inspire you to become a sower in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. Hey, if you are gifted with social media and with Canva or with graphics, I would love to speak to you. And so if you're a fan of this podcast and you're good with social media and with Canva and graphics, would you reach out to me? Because we are looking for some help with our social media. You can do that by emailing ask@thesowerspod.ca. Once again, that's ask@thesowerspod.ca. Thanks in advance for reaching out. Today, I'm excited for you to hear a conversation that I have with podcaster, church planter, Pastor Ben Jolliffe of Resurrection Church in Ottawa. Ben is the host of the Canadian Church Planting Podcast. He had me on his podcast a couple of months ago. You can go back and listen to that if you would like. Ben is also part of the Grace Network, and you're going to hear more about that in this conversation. Ben and I talk about planting, his journey from working with Power to Change to becoming a planter. I think you're going to be inspired and encouraged by this conversation. And so without further ado, here's my conversation with Ben Jolliffe. Well, Ben, thank you for joining the Sowers Podcast. It was really fun a couple months ago to be on your podcast. We'll talk a little bit about that in some time from now. But yes, thank you for joining the Sowers Podcast today.
You're welcome. It's like a home and home. You came to mine. I get to come on yours. I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. Awesome. Hey, would love for you to begin, as many of the conversations begin in this podcast, talking about your own personal journey of coming to know Jesus, of Jesus rescuing and redeeming you. Where were you? When did that happen? What's a bit of the background story of Ben Jolliffe?
I count kind of two significant experiences. So I grew up in a Christian family. My dad was a pastor as well. And so, grew up, learning about Jesus around the dinner table, Sunday school, youth group, all those kinds of things. But one of the most significant experiences I had early in life was at summer camp. Went to like a little Baptist camp up on the shores of Lake Huron in the Goderich area. And, and it was just like, hearing the speaker, thinking about it, I feel like spiritual truths kind of clicked. I was about 8 years old. For the first time, understanding, that I'm a sinner, that Jesus loves me, he's died for me, like those very simple, ABCs of the gospel just made sense for the first time. And I remember kind of raising my hand and, praying with my counselor or cattle leader or whatever. And, that was kind of a significant moment. The first time things kind of make sense. I was baptized kind of in my teenage years, like a typical Baptist kid. 14 years old. And honestly, I don't count that one as super significant. Like, it's a milestone, it's in there, it's important. But the other main experience that I count as significant was the church I was in grade 12, kind of end of high school, went through a big church split. And just kind of like a nasty one. It was a lot about personalities, and like, it wasn't like theological division or even like Sometimes like you fight over important things. This was not a fight over important things. It was a fight over unimportant things. But it nearly split the church kind of in half, where 100 of us left and 120 stayed or something like that. Um, but I left high school pretty cynical and pretty jaded about church. I was still a Christian. I still believed in God and Jesus, but I really didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what it meant. Was yeah, just really frustrated. And I went to the University of Guelph and was an undergrad there, wandering around campus, kind of cynical, playing ultimate frisbee, trying to figure things out. And ran into a campus ministry that was then called Campus Crusade for Christ, now Power to Change. And I felt like I discovered Christianity without a lot of the baggage. Now, in the end, turns out Power to Change has their own baggage. I ended up working on staff with them for a number of years, and it's still a great organization. Love them, but like, obviously, it wasn't perfect. But at that point in my life, it was like, oh, I can do discipleship and evangelism and have Christian community without without some of like the trappings of church, which it was just really important. Uh, it was at a really important part of my life when that kind of happened. And a couple older guys, older students, and eventually a staff member who just took an interest in me and discipled me and met with me and challenged me and kind of poked me. And that was just it was really helpful for my faith. And so I feel like I became a Christian somewhere early in life, but I feel like my faith kind of became my own, and it felt like it took a significant step forward through doubt and difficulty and discouragement, kind of around that first, second year of university. Yeah, so that's kind of like those feel like the two big kind of formative experiences for me.
And then you progressed through school, graduated. You worked, then you worked for Power to Change. Did you work for them right away?
Yeah, I always joke that I majored in power to change and I minored in kinesiology. It was sort of the way. By the time I got through fourth year, I'm like, I don't know if I want to do this. But it was like I gotta. It's good to finish your degree. It turned out to open the door to seminary later on, having a finished undergrad degree. Um, but yeah, so it was very involved as a student by my fourth year, and had decided to at least apply to join staff by the fall of my fourth year, and then had my interview at Christmas. Like, was just kind of just stumbling towards a finish in my in my undergraduate career, but successfully finished. And then yeah, went to work for Power to Change for 5 years at Western in London, Western University. It became Western University in London, Ontario, and had really 5 really wonderful years on staff with Power to Change.
And then transitioning from Power to Change, what happens in your journey next?
Yeah, so again, about 3 years into Power to Change, really liked the ministry, really enjoyed working on campus, but began to feel some sort of like internal angst and feeling unsettled for a couple of reasons. One is that one of the problems with campus ministry is all your favorite people leave, or at least all my favorite people. Like they just kept leaving because they graduate, and that's what's sort of supposed to happen. One of the beautiful parts of campus ministry is, where you send people and where they go and they work and they live all over the world, which is pretty neat. But I feel like it was hard on my minister's heart of just like, man, that person you've invested in for all these years, and it really became a friend because I went to work for them like a year after, so I'm like just a year older than them. I'm younger than multiple students involved with the ministry, and so they're not just sort of people you minister to, but they're friends and dear friends in some cases, and so that was beginning to like wear on me emotionally. I'd find myself in the fall not excited to like meet a new crop, or not that excited to meet a new crop of students, because I'm like, what's the
You're just gonna
point?
leave me.
That's right. You're gonna abandon, and also because in London, like no one stays in London. Everyone's from not London, and so they come to Western for school and then they just leave, which is totally, they go to Toronto or wherever to work. And so that was beginning to wear on me, sort of the emotional toll or the emotional output that kind of takes. I really kind of thought a lot about speaking and preaching. I was kind of excited about that. But as a campus minister, that's a fairly minor part of your role. You're doing a lot of one-on-one and group stuff, which is totally fine. That's what the job is. But I feel like that was a gift I wanted to explore. I've been preaching a little bit. We'd been involved with a church plant in London, Ontario, and I've been preaching a little bit as like a supply preacher there and just really enjoying it. So I felt like there were some giftings I was trying to figure out. And then at that point too, yeah, the church planting movement was kind of getting into full swing. Keller and Driscoll, hashtag canceled. But there's other like there was people who were really beating the drum for let's plant churches everywhere, let's plant them in cities, and yeah, that kind of captured my imagination. And one day my wife just said, like, you realize all the books you read are about church planting. Like, do you realize that? I was like, yeah, I don't think I'd put it together. She kind of had to kind of point it out. But so basically 4 or 5 years into campus ministry, I was beginning to kind of get an itch to do something more in the church planting pastoral type world. And yeah, and that's what kind of led to me connecting with a church called Grace Toronto, a pastor named Dan McDonald, who just spoke at one of our Power to Change retreats. But it's like, hey, here's a person I know actually planted a church. I didn't know very many at that point. We were involved with one in London. That was like I had that one experience. And besides that, I didn't really know anyone. So I kind of cornered him one night and we just like talked for an hour about church planting and pastoring. And I ended up offering sort of like a role at his church to be like a church planting intern. Because it's funny, you want to go plant a church, but I'm like, I've literally never worked for a church before. I have no theological education. It's like a lot of things were lining up, but he's like, if you want to plant a church, you should kind of get some of these things knocked off if you want to do it well. And anyway, so you can ask more about that if you want to, if we're on to that next step.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking about, Grace Toronto, the Grace Network, PCA, and something that I've certainly noticed in many of their churches and church plants is their propensity to bring along pretty early on pastoral residents. So I'm assuming that you were maybe in Grace Toronto as a pastoral resident. And then I'm also thinking about your experience in Power to Change, which I'm assuming was also a pretty valuable element to preparation for church planting. I know other Power to Change, as I'm sure you do, because you were part of Power to Change folks that eventually go on to become church planters, and they're oftentimes really great church planters because they know how to do evangelism and they know how to do discipleship. So talk to me a little bit about those combined experiences of what you learned at being a Power to Change campus minister as it related to starting new things, evangelism, discipleship, and then having the opportunity to be at Grace Toronto with Dan McDonald, and then having your learning continue to be sharpened.
Oh, it's a great point. Tim Keller argues that argued, I suppose, in the past tense, he argued that campus ministry is one of the best preparations for church planting, precisely because of what you said. You learn all the soft skills of ministry. So you go to seminary, you don't learn about how to take the initiative, how to manage large groups of volunteers, how to plan events, like a lot of the things that go into church planting, besides the theology and the preaching. Seminary can't teach you, but campus ministry is fantastic for teaching you, especially if you're starting up a campus ministry, because you're like, well, there's nothing here. How do we make something where there is nothing? How do you find students? Like, there's just so many things. And then it's sort of like this greenhouse environment where people grow and change quickly. And so you kind of see people go from, fresh converts, new to Jesus, to like leaders in your ministry, within a year or two, because you need new leaders so quickly. Everything's turning over so fast that, well, I know you just became a Christian a year ago, but you could do this or you could do
Yeah.
that. And it sort of works. So campus ministry was tremendous preparation for, for any type of pastoral work, but especially for church planting work. And so I feel like I got a lot of those soft skills, people skills, emotional IQ, whatever, all those kinds of things in that environment. But I could sense that I was missing some of the other side of things. And that's kind of where I ended up, talking to Dan, I was called a church planting intern, church planting resident. I can't remember my exact title, but it was kind of focused on church planting even more than just sort of a straight pastoral internship. And what I learned at Grace Toronto is sort of one of the big differences between campus ministry and church ministry is like the pace and like the steadiness, like the steady drumbeat of Sundays and life in a church is just different than campus ministry. Campus ministry, you have these 12-week sprints of semesters where you go hard and you're putting in all kinds of crazy hours. You're working on evenings and weekends. And then it's like, poof, everyone's gone. And you're like, oh, I kind of sleep in for a week and you try to like recover and, whatever you do in the summer. But like church life is a very different pace than that. And I remember Dan telling me you would meet with your one-on-one guys on campus every week. And in church ministry, I meet with them once a month, or maybe every few weeks if there's someone. And it's just the pacing and life inside of church is different because people have a lot of other stuff going on. They have a lot of other life things happening. And also I was kind of theologically, untrained, a bit of a loose cannon. I didn't know where I hadn't made important decisions about where I landed with stuff. I'd grown up Baptist, Grace Toronto is a Presbyterian church. And so I just needed to kind of think through sacraments and ecclesiology and even just to think about them a little bit. Whereas before it's like, yeah, evangelism and discipleship, but like, which is good, but you need to kind of make some more important decisions about how you structure your life together as a church. And so Grace Toronto sort of like slowed me down, gave me sort of like a regular pace, a rhythm to kind of adjust to. It was maybe 250 people, 300 people when I got there. So it's like you kind of join that life of the church and just kind of drags you along, and it's like dum da dum da dum da, like just like the steady march forward of church life. And that's what I really got, along with some really good theological development, both in seminary and my friend Kyle Hackman, who is my boss at Grace Toronto. Um, just lots of talk about church life, sacraments, ecclesiology, like a lot of stuff I hadn't landed on yet and needed to. And so it feels like I got both of those, like different kinds of the different aspects of church life from those different settings. But yes, I'm still a big fan of taking on residents and interns early. We had one very early on at Resurrection. We've now had three or four, and yeah, it helps the church. The church learns to like sort of accept other people, and with a distinct training focus. This guy is, we don't know where it's all going to end up, or this girl, depending on the person. But like they're here to learn and to grow. We are providing a little safe nest for them to kind of play around in and learn stuff. They're not going to be that polished, but we need to find ways to train young people for ministry. So we're going to give them real reps and real responsibilities and deal with the little messes that get left behind as they learn and grow.
So through your pastoral residency then at Grace Toronto, continue to hone some things, help you kind of have your theology kind of shaped and learned. You then the whole residency I'm assuming was okay, well, this is your training ground for you to then take off. So eventually Ottawa comes into mind. Why Ottawa?
Oh, it wasn't my first choice, and that's no insult to Ottawa. Ottawa's a lovely place to live. I wanted to stay in the GTA. I was a Southern Ontario kid, grew up in Cambridge, lived in London, then had lived in downtown Toronto for 3 years. Loved Toronto, and I was like, yeah, so let's stay in Toronto. And it's one of those things where it felt like, well, Grace Toronto was busy planting a daughter church. They were kind of like up to their ears in things, so it wasn't really going to be feasible for me to plant with them. We kind of looked around at a few other spots, a couple suburbs in Toronto, and honestly, either it didn't really stand out, or we couldn't find anyone who was interested, or doors kind of closed in that sort of spiritual, mysterious way.
Hmm.
And then we met a few people from Ottawa who are like, "Have you thought about planting in Ottawa? We could really use a church like Grace Toronto." They would visit Grace Toronto, and so we kept meeting people. We came for a visit, met a couple other people, and we're like, really seems like the Lord seems to be doing something here. It's at least a city. We were kind of like city people, so it feels like, well, it's something. It's not Toronto, and so in that sort of mysterious way, it felt like the Lord closed doors in a lot of other places while opening one in Ottawa. And even there's a couple who came to Grace Toronto, and they're like, we hate living in Toronto. We want to move back to Ottawa, but we want a church like Grace Toronto. And I don't know if we would move back if there wasn't a church that we could be a part of. And we're like, well, we're thinking about it. And they're like, we'll move with you. And so it's just like, and we didn't even know them that well. They were like acquaintances, but they ended up becoming dear friends. And actually, he's a church planter in his own right in Halifax now. But it felt like the Lord kept kind of opening ways or paths forward to Ottawa. But yeah, the intent was always church planting, and that's what I had joined Grace Toronto to do. That's what I wanted to learn there. And Dan and the other staff and elders or whatever were very happy to be like, yeah, like they didn't feel a sense. I didn't really feel a sense of like control, like, well, you owe us because we've grown you up from like a raw church planter into like, or a raw campus minister into a church planter. I was like, no, go, be blessed. We don't have much to send with you, but great, we'll support you however we can. And but that did lead eventually to getting here to Ottawa.
And so you plant Resurrection Church, and then your logo is a rooster. So I'm always keen to understand logos in contrast to names. So why Resurrection Church, and then why the rooster image?
That's a good question. We went through lots of them. I feel like the three or four, it feels like my decision about church planning. The three or four favorite names were all taken. And so I was like, oh, maybe something with Grace, because we were out of Grace. And of course, there's already like 18 churches that are named Grace. And I can't remember the other ones we considered, but all my favorite names were taken. So Resurrection was like fifth on my list or something. So it kind of pairs with the rooster. So what we liked about the rooster, one is we wanted to emphasize we were a new church. And so I wanted a logo that looked kind of different. I didn't want like, the river with a cross, and a Bible open, or, like, not to disparage any other church's logo, but like we just wanted something that would be different. And when people looked at it, they're like, oh, that church hasn't been around here. There's something going on with that. But the rooster, a bit of research had taught me that it's one of the Christian symbols from quite early on, going all the way back to, Peter's betrayal of Christ and the rooster crowing. But so along with the fish and the cross, obviously, it was used somewhat in the early church, but it was used a lot in the Reformation too. And so what Protestant churches in Europe, when a Protestant church would take over a Catholic church, or when an area would convert one way or the other, they would sometimes take the cross off the steeple and put a rooster on it. And the symbolism there was that like a new day is dawning. When does the rooster crow? The rooster crows at the start of the day. And so there's a new day dawning in Christendom, in Christianity. We're rediscovering something important. And so I kind of like that imagery. We're in the Reformed stream, and so that appeal to the Reformation really kind of struck me. And just like the rooster announcing a new day, and so with resurrection, we're announcing there's a new life beyond this one. The old is gone, the new has come, like Paul talks about in Corinthians. And so it kind of fit like the newness, arrival, change, the rooster and resurrection all kind of went together. But also one of the reasons we chose resurrection is just it wasn't really used. I couldn't find, there was one Catholic church that was like the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ, something Catholic church, but there were really no Protestant churches that were called resurrection. And so it just felt like we can just have our own little niche, our own little thing. So it was a bit of like a branding decision, but it was also, I really liked some of the symbolism behind it. It was kind of a little bit of both.
And the tagline on your website is, "We welcome the convinced and unconvinced, the bored, the burned, the cynical, the religious, the irreligious, and the spiritual." And I even think about the rooster image. I mean, if you go to the denial, that there is also this redemption that kind of comes through that experience. And so you've intentionally, I mean, oftentimes if it's non-Christians, they're coming to a website first. They maybe see your logo and your sign on a Sunday morning. They look you up and they find this statement. So take us into this statement a little bit. One, why do you think statements like this on the homepage of your website where somebody lands is so important? I mean, you've kept it there over the years. So what is it about this statement that is so essential to you and to the ministry of Resurrection Church? And yeah, the different descriptors here.
Yeah, the first thing you see on a website, I think, is really important. And so, yeah, for that initial Google search, someone pulls up the homepage, what do they see? And, as a church plant, we just wanted to welcome everyone. I think sometimes churches err either on the side of welcoming the already convinced. And so it's like, oh, the happy Christians looking for a new church home, we want them. And it's good that kind of websites are tilted towards those folks, or it's tilted very towards, non-Christians. Like, oh, do you want to understand who Jesus is? Or, and that's also really good too. And I can see that's a wonderful impulse. And so part of me is like, I wanted people when they read that statement to sort of be able to find themselves in it. And to say like, oh, this could be a church for me. I'm kind of a cynical person, or but we also want to be like, look, I'm a happily convinced Christian, and I'm just looking for a healthy church home. I just moved to the city, trying to figure things out. I also want them to feel welcomed. And also, I mean, at some point, probably most of those words could have described me at different points in my life. First year university Ben was quite cynical and disillusioned. Fourth year university Ben was pretty excited and convinced, and along the way, you kind of go between these different stages. And so part of it's a welcome to different kinds of people. And part of it's, over the long term, that you can belong here, even if you end up moving from convinced to unconvinced, or if you move from satisfied to cynical, or like as you go through different stages of life, like we don't want you to leave because you're having doubts about Jesus. We actually want you to stay and process them and work through them here. So we want that welcome to sort of be wide, like the posture. I know it's an audio podcast, but the posture is like arms open. Like you can come, like your kind of person who you are is welcome at our church. And so it's not even a mission statement, but it's just been like the posture we want to take towards people who are coming is to kind of get all kinds.
Friends, we'll get back to my interview with Ben Jolliffe in just a moment. Prior to that, however, I want to let you know about the Grace Network. The Grace Network is a collection of Canadian churches and pastors that are reformed, missional, gospel-centered, and prayerful. While the Grace Network does not ordain, it works with denominations who are already experts in that area. And what they do is coach, train, network, and fund churches and church planters. They tailor their approach to who you are and to what you need. The Grace Network is on an ambitious plan to train more young people for ministry, plant more churches, help churches get back on mission, and multiply churches that are thriving, and they'd love for you to join them. If you'd like to learn more about the Grace Network, you can go to gracenetwork.ca. Once again, that is gracenetwork.ca. And now back to my interview with Ben. Have you found that being kind of a rally cry statement, not only the first sort of statement you find on your website, but I'm sure something that from the very beginning and continued, how has that shaped the culture of the church? Because I'm sure you've seen, vision statements or mission statements from churches is like helping everyone taking their next step in obedience to Jesus. And, you learn more about the culture of the church and it's like, man, I don't know if they really understand everyone or, so how has the culture been shaped by this statement? How have you, as you've led, needed to continue to remind people, hey, we are here for the convinced, but we're also here for the unconvinced.
Well, I mean, that's always the irony with like the all welcome sign out front of a church is like, it probably means that it probably doesn't mean that. There are certain kinds of people that will feel very welcome and other kinds that won't. I think partially by naming a bunch of things that actually helps. Because when you say all welcome, everyone's like, okay, sure, everybody's welcome. But when you actually talk about discrete categories, and like obviously we could have added 50 more descriptors there. But when you talk about discrete categories, it does help people be like, oh, an unconvinced person, you are also welcome. You're also fine to be here. So in one sense, I think it helps. Also, we begin each service with a welcome that kind of echoes some of that. It's like, if you're mourning and in need of comfort, if you're failing in need of strength, if you feel cynical, if you feel hopeless and wonder if God cares about you, then you're welcome here in the name of Jesus Christ. Like I begin every service with some version of that. I change it up from time to time, but like there's a welcome extended at the beginning of our service too. And we intentionally name sort of like the unpleasant categories, mourning, doubting, cynical, hopeless, etc. And so, yeah, like it probably hasn't taken as perfectly as you want it. I think that every church planter, you end up sort of like subtly disappointed that real life does not match your vision statement with which you raised money and convinced people to come and, whatever. And so in some ways, I'm sure it hasn't lived up to expectations. But we do attempt it. And I think one of the more encouraging parts is that in a Presbyterian system, we have a number of ruling elders, kind of like lay elders, in addition to myself, who function as our elder team or whatever. And sometimes I feel like they are more concerned about evangelism than I am. And I think that's like a very helpful, like they've drunk the Kool-Aid all the way down to the point that they were like, they'll push me to be like, I think we need more things that are oriented towards, people in the community, people in the neighborhood, towards some unconvinced people. Like I think we're tilting a little too far to one side or the other. And so I think that would be one little piece of evidence that some people have sort of gotten it to the point that they're pushing the person who wrote those words, me, to actually believe them and live them out.
Which is a powerful reminder, expression of the gospel. You touched on there, which I think is really helpful and worth exploring, of you now have these other lay elders. At what point did you begin pursuing eldership in the life of your church. I know that in my church plant, someone told me like brilliant advice was, you'll have an elder when you have an elder. And so the advice was don't force it. Don't like, week 2 of your church plant say, "Hey Bob, it's time." You seem great, but it was always in the back of my mind. And as time went on, like as in our polity, like as these men began to really show themselves to be true elders, it became very natural. And I also knew that it needed to happen in order for the church to become independent. So in both in your experience within your polity of the PCA, speak about leadership, eldership, and encourage the church planners out there. Maybe some of them they are not pursuing like a leadership team in this sense, and others are, but what would be your encouragement to them?
The PCA, we have elders for life. Obviously someone can resign or move, or there's ways to get out of it. We don't force you to stay. They're probably going to be at this church longer than the pastor is. And so it's like, if we're gonna ordain a lay elder, like we sort of mean it. And so we tend to move slower on this. So I think, so in the early days, about a year after kind of like moving to Ottawa, I established what we call just an interim leadership team. So I realized I needed input and some more eyes and ears to help me kind of lead the church. So we had 4 couples join me and my wife as like just met monthly to talk about how the church was going. They ended up being small group leaders and, helping like the inner circle of people who are helping with stuff, helping lead things. And we kind of did that for 2.5 years. And then in the Presbyterian world, I can't choose elders by myself. They have to be nominated by the congregation. So we kind of went through like a nomination process and then almost a year of training. Again, because what we're looking for is someone who's really committed to the church long term. We're looking for theological alignment, but really also like missional alignment, that they care about not just what a generic Presbyterian church could do, but what Resurrection Church Ottawa wants to do and be. So a lot of those guys were part of our interim leadership team, but 1 or 2 weren't. And so then it was this process of training, both theological and practical. We began to do elder type things. I could see how they made decisions and responded to stuff. But eventually they have to kind of pass a congregational vote. So the congregation gets to say at the start in the nomination and to say at the end and like the voting. But I kind of did a lot of the training in the middle. So it was almost 5 years before we had kind of our round of elders. We were paying our own bills before we had our own elders is one way to think about it. Like that came quicker, paying our own bills at about 3.5 years, and then having elders at about 5. And then again in Presbyterian polity, about 2.5 years after that, we got our kind of a set of deacons. So now we have ordained deacons and ordained elders, sort of a more holistic to take. Obviously, deacons doing more mercy and justice, practical type of work around the church. So we're now being like 10 years in, we're like, oh, we're kind of like almost a well-functioning church. We don't have any committees yet. We should get a committee just so that we could have it all together. But we have elders and deacons now at our church.
So beyond on the polity, speak to the unconvinced church planter listening to this podcast who, maybe their history is they come from a background where it's, solo leadership, and they're like, I don't really want to do that. Or maybe they're struggling to have the time. Like, why is this so essential? How did you become convinced of not only this biblically, but also sort of saying, yeah, like this is important as we think about our network and family of churches broadly too.
I mean, I think the biblical argument, honestly, is pretty clear. I think a lot of the pronouns in Timothy and Titus are plurals, and so it's like it seems to pretty clearly insinuate the scriptures that there ought to be more than one. Now, there are trade-offs. I joke, I tell people, I kind of liked being the benevolent dictator in the early days, being like, I get to kind of make the decisions and what I say kind of goes, and you try to be nice and kind about it, but you get to move fast. And I liked that stage. With elders, that a lot of things slow down. It's like, oh, now other people want input on decisions. Oh, this thing that I really thought we should do. I get outvoted on. I really thought we should buy a different video camera to be able to live stream our services. Everyone's like, no, I don't think it's a good idea to spend $4,000 on this one. Like, okay, I guess we're not, or, just, I get outvoted on things. And, the proverb about, like, in a multitude of counselors, there is wisdom. They've saved me from some big missteps, not sinful ones, just like dumb ones, just things I would have missed. Having multiple people thinking about a problem, or thinking about just what's going on in the church is often very helpful. Particularly during COVID, they were invaluable. Just having a multitude of perspectives, so it wasn't just me trying to figure out what we should do, but having a bunch of us sit around the table. Particularly, we had some issues with masks and other things. Conflict in the church around that. Having a number of people around the table to help us work through that was invaluable. Saved me from, again, a number of bad decisions. And on a spiritual side, just having a group of men in our case, but a group of people to pray with, to confide in. Like, there's a circle of that you can deal with confidential things. So as we've had, difficult marriages, people in marriage trouble who need counseling, it's other people to do that, to visit with those people. Two of our elders are retired, so they're flexible during the day. It's like, so if I have a meeting. There's a single woman who came to church. Hey, could you come over to my apartment? I'm feeling very anxious about something that's going on, like kind of in her apartment. It's like, great, I'd love to come. Peter, my elder, he's retired. He'll be joining us, just because going to your place by myself, don't feel great about that. And so just having them around as a support and encouragement, and who also know my inner life to some degree. Because, like, you don't tell all that stuff to the church, but they have much more access to, like, how I'm doing and how I'm feeling and what I'm wrestling with, what I'm praying about. The parts of the church that are bothering me, parts of the church I feel really excited about. All those things. So on, like, a personal level, it's helpful. From, like, a church leadership and strategy level, I find it helpful. And so that would be my main pitch of, like, why I ended up at Presbyterian, why I ultimately believe in sort of Presbyterian church government, like the plurality of elders governing a church. I'm one vote. I'm the chair of the elders board, but I have one vote amongst five. And I lose sometimes, and that's probably healthy for the church.
Well, and there's this particular beauty, as you're talking about, that these elders are not on terms, even though maybe they do have a time 4 years in where they're like, hey, I need to step aside for a season of, my family life or whatever's going on. But they also are, as the scriptures describe, like, they are responsible for shepherding, protecting this community, and they will, and sometimes I'm sure, see the long term or have the long view in front of their minds. And so they're also shepherding the congregation towards that, which may even mean that is you as the primary leader, they also need to see the church even beyond you, to some degree. And so that's really, 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 really helpful to be thinking about. That Resurrection has these 4 values: gospel, mission, discipleship, neighbor. How'd you come to deciding those 4?
It's a good question. I've gone back and forth on values. Like, do we need to have any? I don't know. And other times I'm like, yes, these are the most important thing, and we need to talk about them more. Um, yeah, it's a good question. It's honestly one thing I didn't put a ton of thought into. I think that the value of gospel just I mean, you can almost just have that as your value, because we would say it's not just the way into the Christian life, but it's the way forward. It influences, it tells us how we ought to do evangelism, how we ought to do discipleship, how we should raise our children. Like, it influences and changes everything. And so we wanted to have that one first. We probably could have stopped there, but we did want to say, look, in some ways we would be like, of the simple church genre, if people know that book, but, like, it's like, oh, we do evangelism and discipleship, and things ought to fit into one of those two categories. Sometimes they straddle both, but, like, we don't want to have a lot of other things that we don't know where they fit, but can we kind of direct all of our energy and attention to these two things? And then the value of neighbor just was, it's kind of an acknowledgement that, like, churches exist in real time and space, and we exist in a real neighborhood. And sometimes churches can spread their energy kind of all over a city or a town. Maybe a town is not a good example, but all over a city. Like, oh, we got an event in the East End, and then we're in the South, and then we're this downtown, homeless outreach. We do that sometimes. There's nothing wrong with it. This is a question of wisdom. But it's like, what if we just directed all of our energy to like what's happening in this neighborhood? Our neighborhood's called Hintonburg. And so it's like, can we just find the things that are happening here? And we're gonna try to like when we need to order stuff, can we order it from the businesses that are here? Can we just have a life in this community, acknowledging that we're part of this place? Now, you don't have to live here. And we in our membership class, I mean, people live all over the city. That's fine. But like you should know we're directing a lot of our time and energy and attention to this neighborhood. We're probably not going to move out of this neighborhood to, even if a church came for sale in like, one of the suburbs, like we would move a little bit kind of in any direction, but we wouldn't like leave.
It wouldn't be dramatic.
Yeah, it wouldn't be dramatic. And because part of my conviction is there are not enough churches in sort of city center places or in urban neighborhoods. If you don't have a car, you're pretty limited where you can go to church. And so it's like we had to have some churches that are for all the non-car people. So anyway, so just felt like I just wanted that to be sort of inculcated from the beginning. I want to have that kind of enshrined in the values. So
Ben, but before we end our conversation for today, I was hoping that you'd be able to share a bit about the Canadian Church Planting podcast. Again, I was on this podcast with you. Both of us at some point over the last year said, "Hey, we should think about that. We should think about sharing stories of Canadian church planters." For you, what's been the primary purpose, and then what are you learning, and what is standing out to you as you're interviewing planters in Canada?
yeah, very similar impulse to you, Matt. That like there wasn't many stories of average Canadian church planters just planting churches in Canadian cities and towns and rural areas. And when I went looking for it, I couldn't find it. And it was stories of either sort of large authors writing books about church planting, mostly Americans, American podcasts about American church plants. And that's all I could find. And so I just I wanted to hear the stories myself. I'm a very big podcast person. Lots of sports and business podcasts, but church stuff now and then. And I just wanted to hear the stories of like average people planting average churches in Canada, but the real stories and how they got there and how it's going. And oh, you only have 30 people in your church. Okay, that's great. I'm glad you're doing it. That sounds exciting. And so I just wanted to hear those stories. No one else was doing it, and so I was like, well, I'll do it. And so a lot of the show is just interviews with church planters. We branch out now and then. Actually, I just recorded one with like some church planting spouses. I've done one with like a lay person involved with a church plant. Like they were very, very early on. Just what was it like as like watching it from like sort of the pew, trying to be helpful, the things they learned along the way. And so one thing is kind of like, oh, we need to plant way more churches. We probably need to be far more aggressive in trying stuff than we are. My friend Kyle and I, we often joke that all the guys plant, or all the people, just the women too, all the people planting churches right now need to give their churches to someone else and just all start over because we need all of it to happen again, like ASAP. So maybe those of us like me who've been in my church for 10 years, we just need to turn the reins over to someone else and just go run it back because we need a lot more church plants. So that stuck out to me. And then the other thing is that, yeah, the stories you often hear of church planting and growth, they're just they're irregular, or they're not the norm. Lots of people I've interviewed have been at it for 3, 4, 5 years and are just sort of have like a church of 50 or 60, maybe 75, are just paying their bills. And so it's really wonderful when something explodes and they plant a daughter church and that daughter church is a daughter church 2 years later. And like, that's great. That mostly happens in large cities because of like the density of population. It's just there's plenty of other people who are just like, I'm just kind of doing my thing, and it's me and 85 people, and we pay the bills, and it's good work. Yeah, and actually, the one other thing that stands out is that there are so many small towns just dying for a church plant of any sort, like something with a bit of like life and vitality. Our cities, they're somewhat well served. There's church plants, decent church plants in most major cities across Canada, decent churches as well, of course. But like, there's so many small towns, 5, 10, 15,000 people, where it's like, there's just nothing. There's like 3 mainline churches that are kind of falling apart, and like, that's it. And we need a lot of people to go to like small and medium sized places, because that's really where the need feels like the need is most pressing in Canada, particularly on the East Coast, particularly on the prairies. But say nothing of the territories. But so those feel like a few lessons that have stuck out from the podcast.
Ben, I'm sure we could talk about these things for much, much longer. Thanks for taking the time today to be part of the Source podcast. And we'll definitely get you back on in the future, and we can hypothesize about how to reach the small, medium places. Well, friends, I'm sure you'd agree that there is much from this conversation with Ben that could be applied as an action step. The thing that I want to focus on, however, is the emphasis that Ben and I made related to statements that give some sort of a definition or future vision for the church that we want to be. On Resurrection Church's website, there is a statement that reads that it is a church for the convinced and unconvinced, the bored, the burned, the cynical, the religious, the irreligious, and the spiritual. Ben talked about the significance of these discrete statements that help define the people that they are trying to reach, and also the people that are present with them. These statements became powerful enough that then the elders of the church, the leaders that Ben was part of raising up and now serves alongside, would also stand by. And so what are the statements? What are the vision or mission statements of your church? Who is your church for? Have you thought through this before? Maybe it's time, following this episode, to write some of these things down and begin to share them with your church so that your church can better embody the type of people and the type of person that you are trying to reach. Well, friends, thanks again for joining us on another episode of the Soars podcast. If this was a challenge to you and encouragement, and you think this would be beneficial to someone else, why don't you go ahead and share it? And now here's a clip from my conversation that will be released next with Jason Ballard of the Way Church in Vancouver, British Columbia.
The most relevant thing is a meal with friends. You don't have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars or whatever it is on film to do something or produce some epic outreach. I'm for that. That's what we did. We invested, and I think if churches have the resources and can do that, that's great. But sometimes we're distracted and we miss what's right in front of us, that the most relevant, compelling thing is human interaction and hospitality.